It all started on a cold October night in Michigan. The trees were bare, their branches swaying in the wind, twisting and creaking like ancient bones. The air smelled of damp earth, and the crispness of the coming winter hung heavily in the air. The wind howled through the woods, the kind of wind that seemed to carry with it secrets that no one should ever hear. The moon was full, but hid behind thick clouds, casting a haunting glow over the desolate landscape. It was the kind of night that made even the bravest people uneasy. The kind of night that whispered of things best left forgotten. In the heart of Michigan, far from the hustle and bustle of the city, there was a small, no one ever stayed there for long. And those who did seemed to leave without saying a word. The residents of this town rarely spoke to outsiders. And when they did, their voices were hushed, as if they feared someone might overhear. People rarely made eye contact, and the few who were brave enough to ask about the town's history were met with vague answers and nervous glances. Had seen something they wished they hadn't. A sight so terrifying that it remained with them, haunting their every step. Jake and Emily, a young couple from the city, had never been the superstitious type. They had grown up surrounded by stories of haunted houses and mysterious legends, but they'd always dismissed them as nothing more than tales to frighten children. But one evening, as they were passing through the small town on their road trip, they stopped at a local gas station to refuel. The sun had just begun to set, and the gas station was one of the few bright spots in the area, a small beacon of light in an otherwise dark and desolate region. They were filling up their car when the clerk behind the counter, a thin man in his late 50s with unkempt hair and a weary expression, caught their attention. His voice was low, almost a whisper, as he spoke. "You folks aren't from around here, are you?" Jake, always the curious one, smiled and shrugged. "Nope, just passing through. We heard some things about this place. It's pretty isolated, isn't it?" The clerk's eyes flickered nervously, and for a moment, Jake thought he might walk away. But then, with a reluctant sigh, the clerk leaned in a little closer and lowered his voice even further. "People disappear, gone without a trace. No one talks about it much. But, well, some folks say it's cursed. They say people went there and they never came back." Jake laughed, assuming it was just another ghost story. "That's a good one. A haunted farm? Come on, man. We've heard it all before." But the clerk didn't laugh. He just stared at them with a look that made their stomachs turn. "It's not a joke," he said, his voice barely a whisper now. "People around here, they know better than to go near it. No one really knows what happens, but the stories, they don't end well. If you decide to go looking for it, you won't come back the same. You'll see things that will make you wish you never came." Emily shuddered, her eyes narrowing. "So, you're telling us the place is cursed?" The clerk didn't respond immediately. He just looked at them, his face pale, his lips trembling slightly. After a long silence, He finally nodded. Some things should stay hidden. You're better off leaving it alone. Jake and Emily exchanged a look. They were both intrigued. They had heard countless ghost stories and urban legends before, and though they found it all fascinating, they had never once been afraid of these things. This, however, felt different. There was something unsettling about the way the clerk spoke. Something in his voice. Something about the way his hands shook slightly as he handed them the receipt made the hairs on the back of their necks stand up. Still, they brushed it off as superstition, something the locals had made up to keep outsiders away. "Thanks for the tip," Jake said with a grin, trying to lighten the mood. "But we're not the type to scare easily." The clerk gave a small, nervous smile, but his eyes remained filled with fear. "Just remember, some things are better left forgotten," he said before walking away. As they left the gas station, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She tried to ignore it, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the clerk's warning. It had sounded so real, so desperate. She glanced at Jake, who seemed deep in thought, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Do you think there's anything to what he said?" Emily asked, her voice soft. Jake shrugged, trying to dismiss her worries. "Probably just a local story to keep people out. People get bored in places like this and make up these things to entertain themselves. Besides, what harm could a creepy old farm do?" But as the night grew darker and the wind began to pick up, Emily couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The trees loomed on either side of the road like twisted shadows, their bare limbs scratching at the windows. The further they drove, the more the world outside seemed to change. The streets became narrower, the houses fewer and farther apart. The silence outside was oppressive, almost suffocating. The only sound was the hum of the tires on the asphalt and the occasional gust of wind rattling the car. "Jake, I don't know if we should be doing this," Emily said, her voice trembling slightly. Jake looked over at her and gave her a reassuring smile. "We're just going to check it out. We'll drive to the farm, take a look around, and then leave. It'll be fine." But even as he said the words, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were heading into something much darker than they had anticipated. The wind picked up again, howling through the trees, and for a brief moment, it almost sounded like a distant cry. A cry of something lost, something buried, deep in the heart of those woods. "All right," Jake said, his voice firmer now. "Let's go find out for ourselves." And with that, they drove deeper into the woods, towards the farm, unaware of the horrors that awaited them. The air felt thick with unease as Jake and Emily continued their journey, the wheels of their car humming against the forgotten road. They had been driving for miles, guided only by the vague directions from the gas station clerk, and the unsettling feeling that they were heading deeper into something they couldn't fully understand. The GPS had long lost its signal, its screen now blank, leaving them with nothing but the dim headlights to illuminate their way. The narrow, overgrown road wound through the dense forest, the trees towering high above them like silent, sentinels. Each twist and turn seemed to lead them further from civilization, and the air grew colder with every mile they traveled. The fog, thick and suffocating, rolled in from the woods, curling around the car like a ghostly embrace. It blanketed everything in its path, obscuring the road ahead and making the trees appear even taller, even more menacing. The darkness was impenetrable, and the pale glow of the headlights barely made a dent in it. The world around them felt as if it were closing in, the oppressive silence growing heavier with each passing moment. It wasn't just the lack of sound that made the air so stifling. It was the feeling that something was watching them from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. As they continued, the sense of isolation grew, and with it, the creeping sensation that they had made a terrible mistake. Emily glanced nervously out the window, her eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of life, any hint that they hadn't just driven into the middle of nowhere. But the trees were thick, their branches intertwining above them, blocking out the sky and casting the world below into an almost impenetrable darkness. It was as if the forest itself had swallowed the road whole, trapping them inside a place they couldn't escape. Jake kept his hands firmly on the wheel, his knuckles white from the grip. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by a quiet tension that he couldn't shake. He tried to reassure Emily with a smile, but even he could feel the chill creeping into his bones. The closer they got to the farm, the more the air seemed to thicken, like the very atmosphere had been poisoned by something old and dark. It was hard to ignore the nagging feeling at the back of his mind that perhaps they were being led into a trap. A place where the boundaries between the living and the dead were thin, and where those who ventured too far never returned. "Maybe we should turn back," Emily said, her voice shaky despite her attempt to sound confident. She glanced over at Jake, her face pale in the dim light. "This doesn't feel right." Jake opened his mouth to say something, but the words caught in his throat. He knew what she meant. He could feel it too. The heaviness in the air, the weight of the unseen eyes that seemed to follow their every move. But he didn't want to admit it. Not yet. They had come all this way. They were so close. "We're almost there," Jake said, his voice strained. "Just a little farther." But even as he spoke, he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. The road ahead was empty. No sign of any other houses. No signs of life. It was just them, alone in the dark, surrounded by trees that seemed to close in on them more with every passing second. He thought back to the gas station clerk's warning, his words echoing in his mind. "You won't come back the same." It was too late to turn back now, though. They had come too far, and part of Jake wanted to see the farm for himself, to uncover whatever secrets it held, no matter how terrifying those secrets might be. And part of him was hoping that it was all just a story, just another ghost story to entertain bored travelers. The fog grew thicker, curling around the tires, swirling in the headlights like something alive. The forest had become an endless sea of shadow, the trees blotting out the world. The air felt colder now, biting at their skin, making their breath visible in the cabin of the car. The silence pressed in, thick and heavy, as if the forest was holding its breath. No birds, no rustling of leaves, just an empty void. Then, just as the tension reached its peak, they saw it. A faint outline, barely visible through the fog, but unmistakable nonetheless. The farm. It appeared suddenly, like it had materialized from the very shadows, its silhouette rising out of the darkness. The car's headlights illuminated the weathered wooden structure, revealing a house that seemed to sag under the weight of its years. Its windows were broken, the glass shattered long ago, leaving behind dark, empty holes where eyes once stared out at the world. But it wasn't the house that sent a cold shiver down Emily's spine. It was the barn. Standing apart from the house, the barn was much larger and much more unsettling. Its walls were blackened, as if they had been scorched by fire, and the roof was half collapsed, sagging under the weight of time and decay. The barn loomed like a dark sentinel, watching them with an unblinking stare. But what truly terrified Emily was the strange, flickering red glow coming from within. It wasn't a normal light. There was something wrong about it. It pulsed as if something was alive inside, something that shouldn't be. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. Emily's heart raced in her chest as she stared at the barn, her breath shallow. There was something wrong with that light. It didn't belong. It was too unnatural. She could feel the hairs on the back of her neck standing up, and a cold sweat began to form on her brow. Jake slowed the car, his eyes fixed on the barn, his face pale. He too could feel it, the unease, the sense that something terrible was waiting for them. But he wasn't ready to back down. Not yet. "Let's take a look," Jake said, his voice low, as if speaking louder might somehow disturb the farm's dark secret. Emily didn't answer. She simply stared at the barn, feeling the weight of the place pressing down on her. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to leave, to turn around and drive as fast as they could out of there, but her legs felt frozen to the seat. She wanted to believe it was just her imagination, but deep down, she knew better. It was too late to turn back now. They had come this far, and there was no turning back. Slowly, Jake pulled the car to a stop, the engine ticking in the silence, the only sound in the vast emptiness around them. For a long moment, neither of them moved. They just sat there, staring at the barn as the fog closed in around them. The red light flickered again, casting an eerie glow on the abandoned farm. And for the first time, Emily felt a genuine fear grip her heart. Whatever was waiting for them inside that barn, it was real, and it wasn't going to let them leave without a price. The barn door groaned as Jake pushed it open with a hesitant hand, the rusted hinges protesting with each creak. The moment the door swung wide enough for them to step inside, a cold rush of air hit them, thick with the pungent smell of rust and decay. The air was stagnant, heavy with the weight of years of neglect. The floor beneath their feet creaked as they entered, the dust rising in small clouds as they disturbed the stillness. The barn felt ancient, as though it had not seen a soul for decades. Yet the air was suffocating. Jake and Emily stood there, blinking in the dim light that filtered through the broken windows. The flickering glow of the red light outside cast eerie shadows against the walls, but the barn itself seemed darker, almost as if the darkness inside it had a life of its own. As they stepped further in, the silence was almost deafening. There were old farming tools scattered haphazardly on the floor, rusted plows, a cracked hoe, and a few broken pitchforks. But what unsettled them the most was the feeling that something had been left behind in this barn. Something not just of the past, but of the present. Something waiting. Their eyes were drawn to the far wall, where a strange symbol had been carved deep into the wood. The markings were crude but deliberate, a twisted combination of lines and shapes that resembled ancient runes. They were unfamiliar, unsettling, too complex to be random, too calculated to be a mere decoration. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he studied the symbol. It looked almost alive, as if the wood itself had been carved into a writhing mass of energy, something ancient and dark. But what really made Jake's stomach churn was the freshness of it. The symbol didn't look weathered or old. It wasn't faded by time. It looked fresh. Jake took a cautious step toward it, drawn by some unseen force. As his hand moved closer to the symbol, the air seemed to grow colder, the silence thickening around him. He couldn't explain why, but something inside him screamed to turn back, to run out of the barn and never look back. But before he could fully process the impulse, his fingers touched the surface of the symbol. The moment his skin made contact with the wood, the barn seemed to shudder, as if it were awakening from a long, stagnant slumber. The floor beneath their feet creaked loudly, and for a brief second, the lights outside flickered, casting the barn in a dim, red glow. But it wasn't just the lights that flickered. The very air seemed to pulse with a strange energy, vibrating in the stillness. The wind, which had been so silent moments before, rushed through the cracks in the walls, cold and biting, as if it had been trapped in the barn for years and was now finally free. Jake stepped back, his heart racing. The room felt alive in a way that made his skin crawl. Emily, who had been standing just behind him, grabbed his arm. Her grip tight, almost as if she could sense something was terribly wrong. "Jake, we need to get out of here," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the growing wind. But before Jake could respond, a voice echoed through the barn, low, guttural, and unmistakably alive. It sounded like it was coming from all around them, reverberating through the walls, like a growl that had been waiting for years to be heard. "Harvest time is here." The words sank into the air like a weight, their meaning heavy and terrifying. Jake froze, his breath catching in his throat. Emily gasped, stepping closer to him. The words repeated, slow and deliberate, each syllable seeming to come from the very walls, as though the barn itself were speaking. The barn door slammed shut behind them with a force that rattled the entire structure. The sound echoed through the barn, deafening in its finality. Jake turned around quickly, his pulse quickening as he tried to process what was happening. The door was locked, the darkness outside swallowed up by the barn's oppressive shadows. Footsteps, the unmistakable sound of heavy boots on the wooden floor, echoing in the silence. The sound grew louder, closer, as if someone or something was walking toward them from the far corner of the barn. The footsteps were slow at first, but they quickened, matching the rhythm of Jake's panicked heartbeat. Emily's grip on his arm tightened, her fingers digging into his flesh as she tried to keep herself steady. Jake's eyes darted around the barn, searching for any way out, but the only light now was the faint red glow creeping in from the outside. The barn was empty, save for the old, forgotten tools and the symbols that marred the walls. There was no place to hide, no escape. They were trapped. And then, from the corner of the barn, something began to move. At first, it was a shadow, a figure, dark and indistinct, creeping forward with unnatural slowness. But as it emerged from the darkness, Jake's breath caught in his throat. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its form hidden by tattered black robes that seemed to merge with the shadows. The face was hidden beneath a hood, but Jake could feel its presence, the weight of its gaze, even without seeing its eyes. It wasn't human, not in any way he could comprehend. The footsteps stopped just a few feet from them. The barn fell into an even deeper silence, broken only by the soft rustle of the figure's robe. Jake could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, suffocating him in its tension. He wanted to speak, to ask what was happening, but his voice wouldn't come. It was as if the air itself had been stolen from his lungs. The figure raised a hand, its fingers long and gnarled, the nails black and jagged. With a slow, deliberate motion, it pointed toward the center of the barn. Emily gasped, her eyes wide with fear. In the center of the floor, a small circle had been drawn in chalk, its edges frayed and uneven, but unmistakable. Inside the circle, there were symbols, the same symbols that had been carved into the wall. Only now, they seemed to glow faintly, pulsing with a faint, sickly light. Jake's heart raced as he realized what they were witnessing. This wasn't just some ghost story. This wasn't just a cursed farm. This was something older, something darker, something that had been waiting just below the surface for years. And they had just stepped right into its grip. The figure stepped forward, and for the first time, Jake saw its face. Or, rather, what was left of it. It was pale, almost skeletal, with skin stretched too tight over a skull that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. Its eyes were nothing more than dark, hollow pits, and its mouth, if you could even call it that, was a jagged, ragged line of teeth. It opened its mouth, and the sound that escaped was a low, guttural growl, the same voice they had heard before. "Your souls will be the harvest." The words seemed to echo in the barn, reverberating through Jake's bones. Time seemed to stop, as if the world itself had been frozen in place. Emily let out a terrified scream, but before either of them could react, the figure took another step forward, and the barn door slammed shut behind them once again. They were trapped, and there was no escape. The footsteps echoed in the barn, their speed unnerving, too fast, too deliberate. Jake and Emily turned at the same time, expecting to see something, someone coming toward them. But there was nothing, just the shadows, the kind of shadows that seemed to stretch further than they should, twisting and shifting in the dim light, as though the very darkness was alive, watching them. Emily's heart raced in her chest, and she took a step closer to Jake, her breath shallow. The oppressive silence in the barn felt like it was pressing in on them, suffocating them. The feeling of being watched was stronger than ever, but there was no one there. They both stood still, the hairs on the back of their necks prickling, waiting for something to move, for anything to make a sound. But the barn remained eerily still. The only noise was the faint hum of the wind outside, the occasional creak of the wooden walls shifting with the weight of time. It felt as though the barn had swallowed up all sound, all life, leaving only a palpable sense of dread in its wake. Emily's eyes darted around the room, her mind racing. She needed to do something, needed to find some kind of explanation for the sense of danger that was crawling up her spine. She took a hesitant step forward, her feet barely making a sound on the dusty floor, and her gaze fell upon a small table in the far corner of the barn. It was covered in a layer of dust, the wood darkened with age and neglect. But what caught her attention was the old, yellowed journal resting on top of it. The edges were tattered, and the cover was cracked, as though it had been handled by countless hands over the years. Something about it seemed important, like it held the answers to the questions that had been gnawing at her since they arrived. "Jake, look," Emily whispered, her voice low and trembling. She gestured toward the table, her fingers pointing at the journal. Jake, who had been staring into the shadows, his eyes wide and wary, turned toward her, his gaze following her finger. Without a word, he stepped toward the table, his steps slow and deliberate, as if any sudden movement might make the barn react in some unpredictable way. Emily carefully picked up the journal, her fingers brushing against its fragile pages. The scent of old paper and mildew filled the air, and she felt a shiver run down her spine as she opened it. The pages were thick and heavy, the ink faded in places, but still legible. She skimmed through the first few pages, her eyes catching the odd, disjointed entries that filled the margins. The further she read, the more the words began to make her feel uneasy. She stopped on one particular passage, the words standing out against the rest of the text. This place, it's cursed. Emily's voice trembled as she read aloud, her words seeming to echo off the walls of the barn. It was supposed to be a sanctuary. The people who lived here, they were part of something much darker. Jake's stomach twisted at the words, and he moved closer, peering over her shoulder as she continued reading. Jake swallowed hard, his mouth dry, his hands clenched into fists. What does this mean? He asked, his voice barely more than a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might disturb whatever dark force lurked in the shadows. Emily's voice trembled as she continued reading. The people who lived here, they were part of something much darker, she repeated. They performed rituals, sacrifices, to keep something alive. Something evil. Her heart skipped a beat as the realization began to settle in. The farm, the people who had once lived here, the whispers and warnings from the townsfolk. It was all connected. This place wasn't just abandoned. It had been left for a reason. They hadn't just vanished into thin air. The words in the journal were becoming clearer now, their meaning more disturbing with every line. Emily could feel her stomach churning as she read the final passages. The last entry was scrawled in hastily written, uneven handwriting. The harvest isn't about the crops. It's about people. It wants more. Jake's breath caught in his throat, and he stepped back from the journal, his eyes wide with disbelief. Wait, you mean it wants people? Like, for whatever it is? Emily didn't answer immediately. She stared at the final line, her mind racing to process what she had just read. The barn, the farm, the townspeople. They had been part of some kind of dark ritual, some unspeakable act. The harvest wasn't just a seasonal tradition. It was a twisted, horrifying ceremony that demanded more than just crops. It demanded flesh. It demanded souls. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Whatever had been summoned by these rituals, whatever evil force had been kept alive through the sacrifices, it wasn't finished. It wanted more. And now, they were here. They had wandered into its domain, unknowingly stepping into a place that had been forgotten by time, but not by the evil that lingered in its corners. Jake's pulse quickened, and he turned away from the journal, his mind spinning. He tried to make sense of it all, but the more he thought about it, the more the pieces seemed to fall into place, each one darker and more twisted than the last. The people who had lived here, they hadn't just disappeared. They had been claimed by whatever dark force had been feeding on them for so long. And now it wanted more. He glanced over at Emily, who was still standing there, her eyes wide with horror. He could see the fear in her eyes, the same fear that had been building inside him ever since they set foot on the farm. The barn felt alive, its walls closing in, its shadows stretching long and thin, like the hands of something ancient and hungry. They weren't alone here. Not anymore. Emily, Jake said, his voice tight. We need to get out of here, now. But Emily didn't respond. She was still staring at the journal, her face pale, her lips trembling. It wasn't just the words on the pages that frightened her. It was the feeling in the pit of her stomach, the growing certainty that they had disturbed something that should have remained buried. The air seemed to thicken with every passing second, the shadows growing deeper, darker. She could feel it now, the presence of something just beyond their reach. It was waiting for them.
Without a word, Emily closed the journal and handed it to Jake. He didn't take it right away, his eyes flickering toward the door, his hand frozen mid-air. There was something behind him. He could feel it, a subtle shift in the air, a presence that was growing stronger. The barn was no longer empty. The footsteps, once distant, were moving closer now, too fast to be real. And when Jake turned around to face the darkness, there was no one there. But he knew that whatever had once lived here, whatever had been kept alive by those rituals, was not just an ancient evil. It was a part of the land now, and it was hungry. "Jake," Emily whispered, her voice trembling, "we're not alone." The walls of the barn seemed to close in around them, and the shadows that had once been still and silent now seemed to pulse with life. The presence in the barn was no longer just a feeling. It was real, and it was coming for them. And they had just stumbled right into its grasp. The silence that had enveloped the barn was shattered by a low, growling voice. This time, it was closer. Much closer. The words came through the air, thick with malice and hunger. "You're the harvest now." Jake froze, his blood turning to ice. He looked at Emily, who stood beside him, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. The words echoed in his ears, vibrating through his skull. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. Something in the air had changed, thickened, and the oppressive presence in the barn felt like it was closing in, surrounding them. It was as though the very walls were alive, watching them, waiting. Emily gasped and stumbled backward, her breath quick and shallow. Something moved in the shadows, just beyond the reach of their headlights. But it wasn't just a shadow. It was more than that. Something that shouldn't have been able to move. Something that was not of this world. She could feel it, the presence closing in on them. Something ancient, something hungry. The darkness seemed to swirl around them, thick and suffocating, and she couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All she could do was stare into the blackness, her heart pounding in her chest. Without warning, the floor beneath them cracked. Jake barely had time to react before the ground gave way, and he and Emily plunged downward, falling through the rotten wood. The darkness consumed them as they fell, their bodies slamming against the hard, cold earth below with a sickening thud. Emily cried out, but her voice was swallowed by the abyss. She felt Jake's hand on hers as they tumbled into the unknown, their bodies crashing into the cold, unforgiving ground. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The world seemed to pause, suspended in time. Jake groaned beside her, his body stiff from the fall. But he managed to sit up. His eyes darted around the chamber, taking in the overwhelming sight. The air was thick, with the scent of decay, and the temperature was cold, far colder than it should have been underground. The red light flickered again, casting long shadows across the chamber, and they both instinctively turned their gaze toward it. As they moved closer, the reality of what lay before them began to sink in. The chamber was massive, stretching farther than they could see in the dim red glow. The walls seemed to pulse with an energy they couldn't comprehend, a silent rhythm that sent a chill through their bones. And then they saw it, the horror they had only heard whispers about in the town, the thing they had never dared to imagine. Hundreds of old, twisted figures hung from the walls. The sight was enough to stop their hearts. The figures were skeletal, their bodies shriveled and decayed, the skin clinging to the bones like parchment. But it wasn't the grotesque bodies that terrified them the most. It was their eyes, wide open, staring into the void, unblinking, frozen in a state of terror. The bodies were suspended by thick, rotting ropes, twisted and tangled around their limbs, their faces contorted in expressions of sheer horror, as if they had been left to suffer for eternity. Jake stepped back, his legs trembling beneath him. His mind struggled to comprehend what he was seeing, but there was no denying it. The figures were real, or at least they had once been. They had once been people, men, women, children, who had been brought here to this cursed place, to be sacrificed, to be consumed. They were the harvest, and now they were nothing more. Who are they? Emily's voice was barely a whisper, but it echoed in the vast chamber, amplifying the terror that gripped them both. Jake didn't answer. He couldn't speak, couldn't process the horror that was unfolding before them. His mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of the nightmare they had walked into. The town, the farm, the disappearances, it was all connected. The people who had vanished had not been taken by some unknown force. They had been consumed by something far older, far darker. They had been harvested, just like the twisted bodies that now hung from the walls. Emily took a step forward, her eyes never leaving the figures. She felt sick to her stomach, but she couldn't look away. She needed to understand. She needed to know how this could have happened, how people could do such horrible things. Why? She whispered. Why are they here? Jake's voice cracked as he finally found the words. They were part of it. The harvest. It wasn't just crops. It was people. They fed it. Whatever it is, they kept it alive. The realization hit them both at the same time. The harvest wasn't about gathering food or crops. It was about feeding something ancient, something evil. The farm, the town, the disappearances, they were all part of a twisted ritual, a never-ending cycle of sacrifice. The people who had disappeared had been consumed by the darkness that had been allowed to fester here for generations. They had become part of the ritual, part of the harvest that kept the evil alive. The walls of the chamber seemed to close in on them, and the air grew colder still. The shadows that had been moving in the corners of the room now seemed to reach out toward them, creeping closer with every breath they took. It wasn't just the harvest that was alive. The entire place, the farm, the barn, the chamber beneath it, was alive with a hunger, a darkness that had been fed for too long. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she realized the truth. The people who had disappeared were never really gone. They had been consumed, twisted into something else, something that could never escape. They were the harvest, and now they were nothing more than empty shells, their souls trapped in this place, their faces frozen in terror for eternity. Jake grabbed her arm, pulling her back toward the edge of the chamber, his grip tight, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice trembling. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew it was too late. The farm, the evil that had been feeding for generations, was not done with them. They had stumbled into its grip, and there was no escaping the harvest once it had claimed you. Suddenly, a low growl rumbled from the shadows, and the ground beneath their feet shifted. The chamber seemed to pulse with a sinister energy, the air thick with an unbearable pressure. The walls groaned, and the shadows deepened, stretching toward them like fingers reaching out to claim them. The harvest was not over, and they were the next to be claimed. The barn was deathly quiet now, the air heavy with anticipation, the kind of silence that precedes something inevitable. It wasn't just the stillness that had settled in. No, this was something deeper, more primal. It was as though the very earth beneath their feet was waiting for the next move, the next step in a terrible, unspoken ritual. Emily's pulse pounded in her ears, and she couldn't seem to shake the feeling that something was moving just beyond the edges of her vision. Something waiting. Jake stood motionless beside her, his eyes darting around the barn as though he could see the invisible threads that connected the space they were in to the darkness outside, to the terrible history that haunted this place. She reached out to touch his arm, to pull him away, but before she could speak, they both heard it, the soft, scraping sound of claws dragging across the floor. It was faint at first, like the distant rustling of something large moving in the shadows, but it quickly grew louder, more distinct. The sound was inescapable now, filling the barn, each scrape echoing in the hollow silence. It was closer. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't move, couldn't tear her eyes away from the darkness. The noise was slow, deliberate, like something or someone was dragging itself toward them with purpose. Her heart raced, the instinct to run clawing at her chest, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. Jake's face twisted with horror as the noise grew louder still. He turned toward her, his eyes wide with panic. But the look in his eyes quickly changed. It wasn't fear anymore. It was something worse. Emily didn't have time to process what was happening before Jake screamed, a sound so raw
so filled with terror, it sent a chill through her bones. The scream echoed in the barn, reverberating off the walls, and then fading into the darkness. Emily's body moved before her mind could catch up. She turned to Jake, but he was already gone, swallowed by the shadows. His scream still echoed in her ears, ringing in her mind as she searched desperately in the dark for him. Her breath came in short gasps, her chest tightening as the barn seemed to close in around her. The scraping sound continued, now louder, closer, like claws scraping across the floorboards, relentless and fast. "Jake," she cried, her voice barely audible over the growing sound of the thing in the shadows. But there was no answer, only the scraping, and then nothing. Her eyes frantically searched the darkness, but the barn seemed to stretch endlessly, the shadows hiding what she most feared to see. The journal, the terrible things it had written, the harvest, the ritual, the twisted creatures that had fed on fear and blood for generations. She had read it all, but now she couldn't remember the words. They felt distant, fragmented, as though the very darkness of the barn had stolen them from her mind. Then, just as she thought she couldn't take the silence anymore, it came again. The claws, dragging against the wood. The scraping. It was closer now, much closer. It was there, in the dark, just behind her. And she could feel the weight of its presence. Her heart raced as she spun around, her breath coming in shallow gasps, but there was nothing there. Just the shadows, creeping along the walls, stretching toward her like long fingers. Her mind raced, struggling to make sense of the madness around her. She had to move. She had to get out. But her legs wouldn't respond. Her body frozen in place, as though the barn itself had wrapped her in chains. And then, just as her mind screamed for her to run, she heard the final line of the journal echoing in her mind. When the harvest calls, no one leaves. The air seemed to thicken, pressing down on her, suffocating her as she gasped for breath. The growling was there again, low and guttural, but this time it wasn't in the distance. It was in the room with her, right in front of her. She could feel it, its presence closing in like a storm about to break. Her body finally responded, instinct overtaking the terror, and she sprinted toward the barn door. She could see it now, the flickering light outside, the faint red glow of the farm's cursed past. She reached the door, her hand trembling as she fumbled for the handle. But it wouldn't budge. The door was locked. No, it was sealed. The barn itself had locked her in. The scraping claws were louder now, almost deafening. It was too late. She knew it. She could feel it. Suddenly, the red light outside the barn flickered and then went out completely, plunging the space into total darkness. Emily's heart hammered in her chest as she fumbled around in the black void, trying to find any way to escape. Any way out of the grip of whatever waited for her. Her fingers grazed something cold, something smooth, and she grabbed it, hoping it was a way out. But when she pulled, the thing didn't move. It was as if the entire barn had become a prison, an inescapable nightmare, and she was trapped inside it. And then, from the shadows, a figure appeared. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form cloaked in darkness, its face hidden beneath a hood. The air around it seemed to warp, twisting with an energy that made Emily's skin crawl. She couldn't see its face, but she could feel its eyes on her, burning through her, seeing right into her soul.
"Welcome to the harvest." The creature's voice rumbled, low and guttural, like the growl of some ancient predator. The words weren't just spoken, they were felt. A weight pressing on her chest, suffocating her. Emily's breath caught in her throat, and she took a step back, her heart pounding as she finally understood. The farm, the town, the disappearances, it had all been part of a ritual, a dark and twisted harvest that demanded sacrifices. And now, they had come for her. They had come for her soul. The creature stepped forward, its shadow stretching, and Emily felt herself being pulled toward it. She tried to fight, tried to break free, but her body wouldn't obey. The darkness consumed her, pulling her in until there was nothing left but the growl of the creature and the scream of her own soul being swallowed by the void. The last thing she heard was the sound of claws dragging across the floor, echoing into the infinite darkness. Then everything went silent. The wind howled outside, its mournful cry carried by the shifting air. The farm, ancient and cursed, stood still, its hunger satisfied for now. The next harvest would come soon, and the farm would be ready for the next souls to claim. The end. Now, if you ever find yourself driving through Michigan, remember the whispers in the wind. And if the fog is thick enough, maybe, just maybe, you'll hear the growl, too.